This is The Light of St. Lucy, continued. Chapter 3. The Cave of the Yule Lads. The cave was settled in a side of a rocky, snowy hill. It looked like any other cave you might see in the set of rocky hills. But as they came in and turned a few passageways, they came to a round wooden door. Gollygawk opened the door, and Sophie was surprised by what she saw and heard. Inside the door was no more cave, but a large, very homey-looking space, complete with a fireplace, rafters, round windows, and carpets. There were shelves all over with various decorative and some very odd and eccentric trinkets. One thing she noticed that made it different than a typical home was the odd variety of size of furniture. There was a set of table and chairs and other furniture that looked the perfect size for little gnomes. But there was also a table and a few chairs that looked far too large, even slightly too large for a normal adult human. But of course, it was not the furniture that most drew Sophie's attention. Rather, it was the loud, raucous group of funny-looking gnomes. They were singing, practically shouting, some loud song while some were cooking away at a large pot of something on the stovetop. 4 gnomes were banging and clanging out a rhythmic beat, one with his wooden peg legs, another with the slamming of a door. The third one, who looked very skinny for a gnome, indeed seemed to be the skinniest of them all, played an upbeat rhythm with 2 spoons he held in one hand. And the fourth of this percussion group was sitting under a large bed in a corner. Again, a bed that looked a little too large for an ordinary human. And he was banging away on a bowl. 4 gnomes were around the large pot on the stove. One with a large meat hook seemed to be stirring a stew of some kind. A second gnome with a large pot belly was assisting throwing in a variety of other scraps of food. A third hung upside down over the pot with his legs hung over the rafters while he was dropping sausages into the pot. And a fourth was eating a bowl of what looked like yogurt while watching these 3. All 4 of these around the stew pot were also all singing at the top of their lungs. 2 others were dancing on the abnormally large table, one with a very large nose, and the other was very clearly the shortest of all the gnomes. And lastly, the last 2 sat more by themselves in different corners of the room. One was reading a book by candlelight, but seemed to occasionally look up and smile at the antics of the 2 dancing wildly on the table. The last one sat in the corner wearing spectacles, and seemed far more interested in inspecting various trinkets he had sprawled about his desk. Sophie was delighted at the whole happy, homey scene before her, that she couldn't help but clap and stomp along with the music. The song came to an end, and the whole crew broke into loud cheering and applause, with louder banging at their own performance. That's when the large pot-bellied gnome, helping at the pot, looked up and cried in delight, "Gollygawk!" Then, shouting over the continued banging of the other gnomes, as he walked towards Gollygawk in greeting, "Welcome home, my boy! We were wondering when you might get back from your mischief-making. Plus, we've been waiting for your milk to add to our stew, to give it that nice creamy texture, and—" "What is that?" The pot-bellied gnome's eyes widened in surprise as he saw Sophie. He even took a few steps back. His gasp of surprise, all the gnomes stopped at once their clanging, and in their own turn gasped in surprise. "That is a Sophie," said Sophie, pointing to herself, and giving a polite curtsy, not at all put off by their surprised gasps and rude stares. A raucous of shouts and questions came up from all the gnomes at once. "A what? What's a Sophie?" "She's pretty." "She's ugly." "That's a human girl." "Where'd you find her?" "Why do you bring her here?" Finally, there was a loud banging and shouts of, Quiet, quiet, you bellerin' windbags! Quiet! From the gnome at the big pot, banging it with his meat hook. Finally, when all the other voices quieted, he looked very grumpy, walked over, and pointed with his meat hook at Sophie. "What is that doing here?" "That," said Gollygawk, surprised at suddenly how protective he felt of this little girl, "that is a she, and she has a name. This is Sophie." "How do you do?" said Sophie, still not at all put off by the unwelcoming stares of the gnomes. She rather seemed to find it all quite amusing, and seemed to be struggling not to giggle. "Gollygawk," said the gnome again, pointing his meat hook, "you brought a little human girl to our cave? But how? Why?" "Meat hook," Gollygawk interrupted, "I found her in the woods being hunted by the Draugar, and, I couldn't just leave her there, you know." "That's exactly what you could have done. Left her there. That's what any sensible gnome would have done. That's what we've always done. We're mischief makers, and that's all. We don't meddle in the affairs of men. Oh, bother, oh, bother. Your head really is full of stardust, Star Boy. You must take it away, this little girl," he said, pointing at her. Sophie was undisturbed by his outbreak. In fact, quite the opposite. She rather burst out in giggles at this funny little man's outburst. Meat Hook, she now knew his name to be. This, of course, did nothing to improve Meat Hook's mood, and he gave a loud, grumpy harumph. "I'm not just a little girl. My name is Sophie, and pleased to make your acquaintance. I'm sorry to have dropped by unannounced, especially at this late hour," she said, with a polite smile and another giggle. But while her delightful smile and giggling made Meat Hook more grumpy, it had the opposite effect on the rest. The other gnomes found her laugh to be quite infectious, and many of them started to smile themselves. Sophie continued, "Your noble and brave brother gnome, Mr. Gollygawk, saved me, and I am very grateful to the gallant Gollygawk. I am so glad that there are those with bold hearts like his, to be so bold to charge right at the Draugar, driving them back before whisking me away to safety. And now I am very grateful to you, noble gentlemen, gentle gnomes, for your kind and noble hospitality. I give my humblest thanks." As she spoke, Gollygawk swelled with pride, though his face also blushed beet red. "Noble and brave," Meat Hook muttered, and he again harumphed. But the rest of the gnomes looked in awe at Gollygawk, and at the same time felt a stirring in them. They liked the thought of being noble. No one had ever said as much to them, and so it had never even crossed their minds that any of them could be or should be noble. But now that it was suggested that maybe they could be noble, brave, and kind, like knights and heroes in stories, it stirred something in their hearts. A sleeping desire that they didn't even know was there seemed to wake up. And then they all started saying to Meat Hook, "Aw, come on, let her stay. Just for a while. Please." Meat Hook harumphed again, and muttering to himself, went back to continuing stirring the stew pot. The rest of the gnomes, taking it as a yes, all cheered. They each began to gather around her, fascinated by her. They all began to introduce themselves, though it was a bit of a difficult process, for they were all eager to talk at the same time, and they kept trying to shout over the top of each other. Despite all of this, eventually, with the help of Gollygawk, she was able to sort out all of their names. The four who had been banging the rhythm when Sophie first came in were Sheepcoat Clod, with the wooden peg legs, Door Slammer, who had been slamming the doors, Spoon Licker, who skillfully played the spoons and was certainly the skinniest of them all, and Bowl Licker, who banged the bowl and seemed to prefer sitting under furniture rather than on it. The four who had been around the stew pot were, of course, Meat Hook, the grumpy one with the big meat hook, Pot Scraper, the pot-bellied one, Sausage Swiper, the one dangling from the rafters, and Skeer Gobbler, the one still eating a bowl of yogurt. Sophie learned that skeer is a kind of yogurt. The shortest of them all was Stubby, who had been dancing on the table with the big-nosed gnome, whose name was Door Sniffer. Lastly were the two more reserved ones in their respective corners. Candle Stealer was reading his books in the corner by candlelight, and Window Peeper, who wore spectacles, was inspecting his various trinkets. But while these two seemed less loud and more reserved than the rest, they too were curious and fascinated by their new guest. The rest of the gnomes went back to their loud singing and music making and dancing. But this time, they all seemed to try to outdo each other in their playing, their dancing, their singing, seeming eager to show off and impress their new guest. Sophie was, of course, delighted by it all, and loudly applauded all their performances. After some time of this, Meat Hook banged on the pot announcing that food was ready. They led Sophie to the gnome-sized table and chairs, which was also the perfect size for Sophie, and then did something they had never really done before. Shared their food with a guest. In their eagerness to serve and impress her, it became really quite a messy process. Stool bowls slopped and glasses of milk were spilled more than once. But despite this and the poor table manners of the gnomes, you can't blame them though, they didn't know any better. Sophie did the best she could to remember her own manners. Some blushed at her polite pleases and thank yous, and her compliments and kindly words. Others chuckled, but all were quite fascinated by her. At the end of the meal, and after more of their singing, they asked Sophie to sing a song. "All right," Sophie said. "I will sing you a song that my father often sang. He would sing it each night before he went to bed. It was part of our nightly prayers. It was one of his favorites, and he sang and prayed it very sincerely." Her face became thoughtful and distant as she remembered her father. But then in a sweet voice she sang a sweet, haunting melody. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel, that mourns in lonely exile here, until the Son of God appear. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. O come, thou day spring from on high, and cheer us by thy drawing nigh. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadow put to flight. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. The gnomes were in tears by the end of the song. They were so moved, even grumpy old Meat Hook. They sat in silence for some moments. None were eager to break their reflective thoughts and the solemnity of that quiet moment. For in that haunting melody, they felt that same feeling again, of something awaking inside of them. That yearning and longing for something. They didn't have words for it. But it was as if the bubble of their own little world was being burst, and they were beginning to see that there was a much bigger world outside of it. Like they were about to be swept up from their comfortable little lives into something far greater. It was unsettling, terrifying, and thrilling all at the same time. Some of the gnomes then quietly got up and started clearing dishes. Gradually, casual conversation began. Then Gollygawk whispered to Sophie, "Come with me. I want to show you something." He took her over to one corner where there was a free-standing shelf. It was full of various little glass jars and pouches. "This is my collection." "Of what?" Sophie asked. Gollygawk smiled proudly. "Oh, I'm a hobby collector of a few things, mostly stardust, moonbeams, and winds of various kinds. Oh, and also echoes." She looked at a few jars that had a soft swirling liquids. "Moonbeams," he explained. Some of the jars had more silver gleaming liquid. Others had a more orangish hue. Yet others had more of a bluish color. "Moonbeams can only be collected on a full moon," Gollygawk explained, "and not every full moon is the same. In fact, each full moon is slightly different and distinct." He then showed her little jars filled with what looked like bits of glittering sand. "More stardust," he said proudly. "But you have to collect a lot of dust before it is even visible." He pointed to a jar with not more than a thimbleful of dust. "That took me some years to collect from one particular star. You see, you can only collect stardust on the new moon, that is, when the moon is completely hidden. And it's a bit of a tedious task. But look over here." He pointed to other little jars that looked like they had spinning clouds in them. Some spun slowly and calmly, and looked light bluish. Others spun more rapidly. They had different labels on them: warm summer breeze, brisk autumn wind, winter gust, thunderstorm gale, and so on. He began to excitedly explain to Sophie the tricky process of catching a wind in a jar. Sophie then noticed some different seashells. "These are pretty shells. You collect seashells too?" Gollygawk laughed. "No, I don't collect the seashells. I collect echoes. Shells just happen to be the best way to catch an echo. Listen here. This one you can hear the echoes of the ocean waves." He held up the shell to her ear, and she could hear the ocean, the rushing of waves, and even distant call of seagulls. "And here, I caught the echoes of some huntsmen in the mountains some years back." He held up another shell, and she could hear the echoing shouts of men as they blew their horns and shouted to each other as they hunted a deer. She could even hear the hoofbeats of their horses and the barking of the hunting hounds. He excitedly had her listen to a few more of various animals whose echoes he captured, and one of a lady he heard singing, and so on. Just then, they all heard a door in another room slam. "Door slammer," said casually, "Grilla must be back." Then all the gnomes went wide-eyed looking at each other, and then at Sophie, and shouted all at once, "Grilla!" A mad scramble ensued, of the gnomes scampering about, putting things away, and looking all about. Meathook, in a hoarse whisper, ordered, "Hurry! Hide the girl!" "Where?" another asked. "Anywhere! Just hide her, quick!" "Why? What's going on? Who's Grilla?" asked Sophie, quite confused, as a few of the gnomes pulled her away from the table towards a corner. Oh, said Bowlicker, she's just the ogress we live with. An ogress? Said Sophie, eyes widening with fear. Yes, said Spoonlicker, and she is not too fond of human children. Well, rather, she's quite fond of them. It's a little too fond, if you catch my meaning, said Pot Scraper, his belly jiggling as he gave a half-hearted chuckle at his own joke. Seeing her still confused look, Gollygawk explained, She doesn't like human children, but she does like to eat them. Then they shoved her under a bed and piled blankets around her so she was hidden from view. Now you may be wondering why these gnomes had forgotten to mention the fact that they live with a large evil ogress named Grilla, who has the nasty habit of sometimes eating children. Well, you see, these gnomes had only ever thought about themselves for many centuries. Because of this, they were not used to thinking about the consequences of their actions, especially how it affects others. So, they omitted to tell Sophie this important fact, not at all because they were mean-spirited, but simply because it never crossed any of their minds. However, at the moment they heard the door slam, they all instantly realized the potential consequences of their actions, and how it might affect Sophie in a not-so-pleasant way. The door opened, and in walked a large, hideous, ugly ogress. She looked something like an old woman, except she stood at least a foot or two taller than a normal woman, and she had sharp teeth, and claws, and she was hunched with a large humpback, and had greenish-colored skin, and warts, lots of warts, and black eyes, and her hair hung in greasy strands. But other than that, she looked like a perfectly normal old woman, just a lot bigger, uglier, scarier, and monster-like. "Hello, my laddies," she said with a wicked, sharp-toothed smile. "I trust your mischief-making was fun." The gnomes, attempting to look casual, all nodded in unison. She sniffed. "And it smells like you've made a tasty stew. Meathook, it smells like you stole a good cut of meat." She went and inspected the stew. "And Pot Scraper found some nice scraps to add. And my, oh my, look at those smoked sausages. Sausage Swiper, you've done it again." She took a little taste. "And some milk. That is a nice touch. Gollygawk must have found a good farmer's cow to raid milk from." She then paused, sniffing again. A wicked gleam came in her eye. "Did you bring me home anything else?" She looked around at the gnomes, who gulped. "I brought some skyr," piped in Skyr Gobbler, his voice cracking as he offered her a bowl. "Ah, yes. Is that all?" she said, sniffing again. "Anything a little extra scrumptious and special for old Grilla?" she said as she walked over and slowly sat down on the bed under which Sophie was hiding. Sophie could see only inches from her face the big, ugly, hairy feet with big warts and sharp claws. She could also smell them. She held her breath, both in fear and disgust. "Just our usual fares, Grilla," said Meathook. "And Sheepcoat Claude was just telling us about a great sheep scare he did tonight. Startled a whole flock and sent them running in all directions. Didn't you, Sheepcoat Claude?" "What? Oh, yes, Grilla, you should have seen it. It was—" "I should have seen it, huh?" interrupted Grilla. "You think Grilla isn't cunning enough to see far more than you think she does? Like to see this?" With that, she quickly reached under the bed and yanked Sophie out. "A little child? You did bring me a human child. She sure does smell scrumptious. I bet she would go well in this stew. Ah, but Grilla, I heard that little girls are not actually very tasty, especially this one. In fact, we think she's got some disease that might make you sick. That's why we were hiding her, said Meat Hook reasonably. Silence! Shouted Grilla. Since when did you gnomes start bringing home little girls? And since when have you been hiding them from me? You gnomes don't meddle with human affairs. Have you gotten soft? Now you have a soft spot in your heart for humans? Well, I will just throw this one right now in the oven, and that will be the end of that. Now, Grilla, said Meat Hook, grabbing her arm. But Grilla swung her huge arm and flung Meat Hook across the room. The other gnomes gasped. You're testing my patience, gnome. I graciously offer you my hospitality by letting you gnomes live in my cave all these centuries, and now you're going to spoil my fun? You mischief makers have never meddled in my fun, nor I in yours, and we've always gotten along happily, haven't we? Is that going to change tonight? Let her go, Grilla, Meat Hook said again, as he leaned on his meat hook to stand up. I'm warning you. Grilla laughed. Ha ha! Warning me? You're warning me? She cackled and walked over to the oven and opened it up. Sophie was kicking and struggling and trying to break free. A few of the other gnomes rushed over and tried to yank Sophie from Grilla's grasp, but Grilla just as easily tossed them aside, as if they were nothing but stuffed animals. Then, suddenly, in a moment of desperation, Gollygawk knew what he had to do. He took a quick, regretful look at his precious collection of winds, stardust, moonbeams, and echoes, precious items he had tediously gathered for centuries. He knew he had to do something he had never done before. Give up something that he loved for the good of another person. He put his shoulder against his shelf of collection, put his feet against the wall, and he shoved. The tall shelf of his enchanted collection came toppling over, crashing to the floor, jars and shells shattering upon the stone floor. Instantly there was chaos. Winds were whipping around the room, dazzling lights were flashing, a loud cacophony of echoing noises. In the loud and dazzling confusion, Grilla dropped Sophie as she covered her eyes and ears. Next thing Sophie knew, she had been swept out of the cave into the cold winter night, and she was sledding down the snowy mountainside on a toboggan with Gollygawk. Soon the whole troop of Yule lads were sledding alongside them. Meat Hook, Candle Stealer, and Window Peeper a toboggan up to their right. They must have only had 2 wooden toboggans, for the rest of the gnomes used a variety of other things as makeshift sleds. Skeer Gobbler and Bowl Licker each used large bowls as a sled. Spoon Licker and Sheepcoat Clod were on shovels. Door Sniffer, Door Slammer, and Stubby were sledding on what looked like flat metal pans. Pot Scraper was in a big cauldron pot similar to the one they had been cooking stew in. And lastly, Sausage Swiper. The most agile of them all was using 2 large sausages as skis. Soon the whole troop of the 13 Yule lads and Sophie were flying down the snowy hillside at tremendous speed. They heard the distant shouting of Grilla and the fading sounds of the cacophony of collected echoes. Gollygawk looked back longingly up the mountain and sighed. He turned again to face forward and steer the toboggan. The troop of gnomes got to the bottom of the hill and skidded along an icy riverbed for a ways longer. When they finally all came to a stop, they all got up from their sleds and toboggans. They gathered and looked back up toward the large, rocky, snow-covered hill that had been their home. They then looked at Meat Hook, who sighed. Well, lads, It was a good home while it lasted. Sophie came to a terrible realization. What do you mean, while it lasted? Can't you go back again? Meathook gave a dry chuckle. Grilla doesn't forgive easily, and rarely lets go of grudges. Especially after the stunt we pulled, I don't think we'll ever be going back there. Sophie's eyes widened with guilt and gratitude as she realized what they had all sacrificed for her. Their home they had known for centuries was now, because of her, lost to them. Gullygawk's beloved precious collection that he had collected for centuries was now lost to him, and all because of her. I'm so sorry, Sophie began, and tears streamed down her eyes. And thank you, she looked at them graciously, for sacrificing so much to save my life. I'm sorry I've caused so much trouble. Bah, said Meathook. We were bound to upset Grilla sooner or later. She is an ogress, after all. They stood in silence for a few moments, looking up the hill. Well, now what do we do? Asked Pot Scraper, looking at Meathook. They all turned their gaze to look expectantly at him. Sophie was realizing they looked to him as their leader of their little troop. Indeed, as he leaned on his meathook like a walking staff, Sophie thought he almost looked like a little shepherd with his crook, in charge of guiding the little flock of gnomes. Meathook then looked at Gollygawk. Yes, what now, Gollygawk? They all turned and looked at him. Me? Why should I know? You're the one who brought the girl and got us into this mess, said Meathook. And so, you're the one who brought her into our lives, said Meathook. Gollygawk looked down at his feet, feeling ashamed. And, continued Meathook, you're the first one to have realized maybe we should do something for somebody else. To help us realize that maybe we are meant to be braver, bigger than we are. Figuratively speaking, of course, he said, looking at Stubby, the shortest of the gnomes. You made me realize, Gollygawk, that maybe you were right. That you shouldn't have just left that little girl in the woods. Nor should we leave her to the likes of Grilla. And I saw what you did with that precious little collection of yours. So, noble and brave Gollygawk, what do we do next? Gollygawk realized that Meathook did not say this with his usual sarcastic grumpiness, but rather he said this with all sincerity. He meant it. A tear of appreciation formed in Gollygawk's eyes. He quickly wiped it away, then said, We go find the Lady of Light. Something tells me that she will know what to do. Right. I don't know who this Lady of Light is, but I'm trusting you. Lead the way, Star Boy. The 13 gnomes strapped to their backs their toboggans and makeshift toboggans of large bowls, pots, pans, and shovels. Sausage Swiper began munching on his sausage skis. No sense wasting them, he said. He offered a bit to Sophie, who politely refused. Meathook used his crook meathook like a walking stick, for it was nearly as tall as he was. The troop of 13 gnomes and the little girl ventured into the woods as dawn began to break, coloring the sky with soft streaks of light. They were quiet, all lost in their own thoughts and worries of what would become of them, of their uncertainty of all their futures. How about singing that nice song again, little lassie? Meathook said, remembering how it had stirred up something inside of them, something he could not name, but what we would call hope. And so, venturing towards the breaking light of dawn, she sang, and this time the little troop of gnomes quietly sang along. O come thou dayspring from on high, and cheer us by thy drawing drawing nigh. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadow put to flight. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel.